Good morning. Thank you everyone so much for joining us. I'm Amy Burnham, Sales Team Leader at Western Title and Escrow. I'm joined with Hannah Williams, Sales Executive with Western Title, and Ben Hempson, of course, our esteemed guest, Business Advocate for the City of Bend. He'll be covering a multitude of topics surrounding the projects and expansion happening in our not so little anymore town of Bend. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. Please feel free to enter any questions that you have there. We'll go ahead and hold everything until the end of Ben's presentation, but feel free to enter them there and we'll address them at the appropriate time. And just to clarify, please use the Q&A tab. We'll be monitoring that one, not the chat tab. So Ben, take it away.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Hannah. Let's see here. Should work. It worked a second ago. Is that coming through okay?
Yep, perfect.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me. I think we first scheduled this call or this discussion in December, and Amy has been very persistent about working through all of the logistical issues over the last few months. So I'm excited to be here. I think the goal today, I've been thinking about just COVID issues. As mentioned, I'm the business advocate. I've been thinking just about COVID issues for the last 3.5 months now, but I wanted to focus more today, although we'll touch on COVID, on some of the underlying work that has been continuing at the city. I know this is a group that's focused on real estate, and I think touching on where development and infrastructure is going is probably something that hasn't been covered in, I'm sure, the many webinars you've sat in on, as I have over the last few months. So business advocate, a weird title, something I'm not always, I don't enjoy always having to explain at every reception I go to, but I think it's a fairly simple and easy to understand role. I am funded by businesses in town that pay business registration. So my stakeholder group are the businesses in Bend. I often say I'm the contract lobbyist at City Hall for businesses in Bend. And I handle communications. I work with a group called the Bend Economic Development Advisory Board, 9 business leaders who advise City Council on business issues to bring policy forward. And then finally, part of my role is direct services. So if you're stuck anywhere in our city government, whether it's a sewer bill or you don't know where your permit is, I probably can't get you out of any police issues. That's sort of separate, but I'm the guy to at least reach out to. I have my contact info at the end, including my cell phone number, because that's, of course, the easiest place to catch me right now. I'm lucky too today that Justin Livingston, one of our counselors, is here as well. And Justin is willing to weigh in and happy to weigh in on policy issues, the differentiation between staff and council. As a staff member, I work to implement council's vision and direction. So you think about them kind of as our board of directors, Eric King, our city manager, maybe our CEO. Council tells us what to do, they provide that vision and that direction, and then we work to make it go forward. So here's what we'll cover today. I mentioned don't want to talk about COVID too much, but I think we have to at least acknowledge where things stand here in our community and across the country, and then talk a little bit about development as well. Given my role in economic development, there are numerous issues going on that affect city government right now, and I think our country as a whole that you may have questions on. I would note that although there's this nationwide conversation about policing, we're hiring a new chief of police right now. It's really not something I work in economic development, but if you do have questions on that, I'm happy to get you in touch with someone that can dive into more detail there. So, like I said, where things stand. So I think the first thing I wanted to touch on, because we're all paying plenty of attention to this, our unemployment rate through May of this year. We don't have the June data yet, we will soon. You can see, and we're all familiar with the run-up in unemployment, in the unemployment rate back in the prior recession, the Great Recession. While that's an enormous peak, over 16%, and our current unemployment rate, at least the initial estimate, is only a little bit higher than that in April at 18%. That was about a 1.5-year run-up. This time it was a week run-up, right? And we've had something like 13,000 unemployment claims just in Deschutes County. This is very likely an undercount. Sole proprietors, at least at first, when this crisis hit, weren't eligible for unemployment until the CARES Act came through and opened up some avenues for getting that pandemic unemployment assistance, the $600 a week that we've all heard about in the news. But so 18.3% was the initial projection It'll probably be trued up over time as they get better data for Deschutes County, the Bend metro area. We saw a little bit of a dip in May to 16.3%, and I'm hopeful we'll see that continue to squeak down as we get the June data. And of course, we've had at least a little bit of time around reopening and phase 2 reopening by then as well. Bend was really among the hardest hit cities or I should say metro areas in the state. So while we didn't have as many claims as Multnomah County and Portland and Clackamas County and the like, on a per capita basis, the only counties that exceeded Deschutes County in terms of unemployment claims were a number of coastal counties that are almost solely reliant on tourism. So we've been very hard hit here. I don't think that comes as a surprise to anyone. I mentioned the 13,000 jobs lost in 1 month. We went from 85,000 people in our workforce in the Bend Metro in March before the closures to about 71,000 by April. So a very stark drop. You can see where that falls here in Deschutes County. Accommodation and food services and retail, really two of the hardest hit industries in terms of the closure orders early on, and just an enormous increase in county unemployment claims. Again, likely low, that number is likely higher because there is a huge backlog that the Unemployment Insurance Office is still working through. Maybe some surprising ones in there until you think about it. Healthcare and social assistance. Many healthcare systems across the country put staff on furlough to really focus in on confronting the COVID crisis and opening up beds and stopping elective surgeries. And of course, dental offices closed, massage therapy, physical therapy, all of that as well. And then manufacturing and construction, somewhat interesting, but I think just on an anecdotal basis, I certainly know of many manufacturers that idled their production for a month or two just due to supply chain concerns going forward in the short term. So there's ripple effects on these impacts, and I want to touch on one. I think we're going to see many more of them kind of come to light over the next months and into next year. And that's tourism industry revenue, of course, a very obvious one. Here is a slide from Visit Bend's recently approved business plan on what they're projecting to see in terms of an impact on tourism industry revenue over the coming year. You can see that 50% drop in March, 86% in April, and then a recovery barring some kind of backslide in terms of closure orders and the like. This is from a group called Oxford Economics, but Visit Bend tracks our own tourism industry and hotel stay data, and we're tracking pretty closely, at least through May, with what they were saying we should expect. So I think we had about an 88% reduction in room stays, room nights, tourism industry revenue in April. We were actually we ticked up a little bit above that to maybe 72% in May, but it seems like a good ballpark figure, at least in the short term. Now, the ripple effect here at the local government level is hotel tax that tourists pay, either on Airbnbs or hotels, motels, the like. That makes up a significant portion of the city's general fund. So a portion has to go to Visit Bend under state statute for tourism promotion, and we can talk about tourism promotion at the end if folks have questions. But about 70% of that revenue that's collected, last year that was about $7 million, goes to the state or the city's general fund, which funds police, fire, and streets. By and large, those are the three biggest expenses there. That makes up about 15% of the general fund, maybe 20%. And that's an immediate impact we're seeing before we even get into property tax income, revenue and the like, which of course many taxing districts are reliant on. So the city, we've responded, I think, fairly early. This has been a conversation since this crisis began around how do we address these looming budget shortfalls. Every department in the city has already approved a 10% reduction in spending for the coming fiscal year. And there are a number of phases beyond that where, as you start to talk about more impactful changes to both city services and staff, including layoffs, early retirement, restructuring, and the like. But I just wanted to point this out as one ripple effect we're seeing already that we're trying to react to here. Because a question I get a lot is, why isn't the city furloughing people? I think we just have a little bit of a longer lead time before we start seeing some of those effects, and something we're certainly watching right now. So like I said, I didn't want to spend too much time talking about the COVID crisis, but did want to acknowledge all those issues that we are looking at right now. So let's talk about infrastructure. I think I came from the city from the natural gas industry. So of course was very aware of certain infrastructure, but really infrastructure is what drives development, right? Roads and sewer. It's very expensive to build that if it's not already there, and it often is prohibitively expensive to move forward on a project if you have to put a big road in the ground or add a new sewer line. So infrastructure, I would say, has been a huge focus of the Bend City Council. Since I've been here, it's been a huge focus of the Bend Economic Development Advisory Board, who I mentioned. So let's touch on some of the work that's already has been going on. So a little bit of foundational information here. Our construction of infrastructure, whether it's sewer, water, stormwater, or transportation infrastructure, is governed by plans. I mean, government, we like to plan, right? So here you can see the near term through 2024 transportation capital improvement projects. I just wanted to give you an idea of these are projects that are on our list that are going to be worked on, assuming the revenue becomes available. Some of this revenue is, of course, tied to things like development impact fees. System development charges is what we call them, SDCs. You've probably heard that before. So a recession can put the kibosh on some of those projects moving forward, of course, but I'll touch on a couple of them here. What I really want to touch on here, though, is I mentioned the plans. We are in the midst, or really at the tail end, of the development of the next 20-year transportation system plan. So that's the 20-year plan that then feeds into these capital improvement programs that we program out over 5, 10, 15 years to respond to development, to respond to growth. I don't think, even with our current crisis, that Bend is necessarily going to see a real decrease in growth over time. I mean, we may see it in the short term, but even our state economists think Bend is probably going to beat the Oregon projection for growth in the coming years. So this 20-year plan, which was created over a year and a half with a really large citizen committee, a number of consultants, is heading to council, I think, fairly soon, and will be up for discussion, and will then be the kind of course we chart over the next 20 years on what roads are built and which ones are not. And that's sometimes, having joined the city in 2016 at the end of our previous 20-year plan, which ran through 2020, that's sometimes a source of frustration for developers and business owners when they say, well, why can't you build a road here? Because I would benefit from it, and it just wasn't on the plan at the time, right? We're really working on some kind of foundational infrastructure right now, and the 2020 through 2040 plan will build off of that. Okay, so the key challenge with transportation infrastructure is how to fund it. Unlike water or sewer, where you pay a bill every month, just like you do to your natural gas or electric utility, transportation does not have that steady revenue stream to build infrastructure. We have a volatile revenue stream in terms of system development charges that come in when folks develop to pay that sort of impact on the transportation system, but we don't have that steady payment every month, right? So understanding that we were moving into a new 20-year transportation system plan, we had a big backlog of transportation projects, and you can kind of see some of them here. I mean, they were spread all over town. There were projects on Reed Market where there was a whole lot of interest from the community. There are roundabouts. There's on-ramps at Murphy Road and 97, which I know many people were excited about. And really projects spread all over town, numerous roundabouts. What council elected to do earlier this year, after a number of discussions, was move forward with what's called a general obligation bond measure for the May 19th, 2020 ballot. Of course, that's passed now. And essentially a bond, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it, is the community electing to impose a tax upon themselves to pay off that obligation. The rough annual cost to an average homeowner in Bend would have been about $175 a year. But of course, with COVID, the uncertainty around it, and I think with a looming deadline to move forward or pull this off the ballot, on March 18th, council elected, I think unanimously, and Justin can correct me if I'm wrong, to pull that off that ballot measure off the ballot and really just hold tight and see what happened. this bond isn't dead. It's not as if it was voted down. I think the plan had broad support from councilors. They'd done made a number of polling efforts, focus groups, really identified projects that would benefit folks throughout town. And now they're actually revisiting the discussion, and on July 15th, they'll hear the results of some recent polling and chart a course forward and discuss, is there the potential for a bond in a future election in the short term, November, May, or is it something that maybe waits a little longer? So we'll wait and see there, but I wanted to point out that while the bond was pulled from the ballot, certainly not gone as an option to really improve our transportation infrastructure. So let's talk about a couple of projects that are actually underway right now. Back in 2017, councilors worked together, and Justin was one of them at the start of his term, to identify two big east-west corridors and potential projects, one on the north side of town and one on the south side. And those have been underway for a good year and a half at this point. And the southern one is the Murphy Corridor Improvement Project. Really, the gist of, or the potential goal behind some of this is, right now, Reed Market functions a little bit as a funnel heading east and west, right? If you live on the far east side of town, even if you're in the south, it may be easiest to drive up to Reed Market and hang a left if you need to get to the west side. So Reed Market is funneling folks in. Of course, there's a railroad crossing in there that generates plenty of consternation from folks in the community that have sat at that intersection as a train kind of backs up and moves forward and backwards. I know I've sat there as well. So how do we improve the other connections so you don't have to drive up to Reed Market to get to the west side or vice versa? Well, you improve the corridors on the north and south side. So Murphy was the southern one. There was no roadway, so I don't know if you can see my mouse on here. Does the mouse show up, Hannah or Amy? Can you see that on the screen?
Yes, your mouse is showing.
Perfect, that's great. So you can see here this red section, not an existing roadway, and what it did was pushed Murphy through to 15th Street to get a better connection on that north-south side, and that is, I believe, totally complete. The big project along here that I think is going to be the most notable change as the improvements are completed is a railroad overcrossing that's, I think, heading back to council fairly soon here, and that'll be an elevated crossing, so no train delays there at the Murphy corridor. And then from heading down here where you can see spring 2020 through fall 2020 under construction now, there's a roundabout at Broster House, and what we call a complete street. So an improved roadway, a more resilient roadway, so we don't have to worry about items like a cold snap causing a bunch of potholes, for example, sidewalks, a bike lane. I think there's some turning lanes in there as well. And really all the way along here, Country Club Road roundabout, which is, I think, under design. But we're gonna have a really good east-west corridor down there where any of you that have driven down there or drove down there before this construction started will have noticed that there was a pretty good road up until Peril, a new roundabout that was completed in 2016 there at Murphy and Peril. Not so great after that. So that's on the southern end. And this project has actually benefited, at least in part, very small silver lining from the COVID crisis, but we've had such low traffic counts for certainly the first 2 months of this crisis when we had the lockdown orders. Between March 23rd and May 15th, traffic volumes were down 60% in Bend, that we were able to actually accelerate some of the construction along this corridor just because of the low traffic volumes. You weren't impacting that daily commute like you would have been during normal times. So kind of exciting in a weird way, of course, to be able to move that forward a little bit more quickly. The other big transportation project that's underway, of course, is the Empire Corridor, a project that really began with improvements here from kind of 97 moving along, really from the Parkway, not quite from the Parkway, really from this roundabout here at 18th and Empire, improved the corridor there, built a roundabout at Purcell and Empire, which opened last year. And then the big thrust of this project is what's called the Empire Extension. It cuts through Pine Nursery Park, an existing right-of-way that the city had, and actually connects Empire Avenue up with 27th Street. Since I've been around, I've certainly heard many calls for a beltway type road here in Bend. While this isn't a beltway, it does provide that both north-south access on the east side that connects into a road that can get you to 97 that isn't Reed Market, right, or moving into our urban core. And also, I think from an economic development perspective, some really good options for freight movement along there that we're excited to see. So that is under construction right now. I'm not sure when we'll actually have the opening of the Butler Market, Empire and 27th roundabout. I think that's still a little way out, but if you were to head out there right now, you would see them starting to really pull together both the utilities and the actual roadway through Pine Nursery there. So certainly an exciting project as well. And again, these were both funded separately from any sort of bond, really via system development charges and an increase in franchise fees that council agreed upon in 2017, I believe. So I'm a big sewer fan because sewer is often the real crux of the issue when we're talking about economic development. Transportation you can work around, you can have, if you're creating an enormous impact to the system right at rush hour, you can move to shift work. You can't move to shift work necessarily with your sewer use, right? And we have some heavy sewer users in town. We of course have a great brewing industry here, but if you don't have sewer, it's really hard to get businesses located. And of course housing as well, very important. So Bend has what has largely been historically what's called a pressure system, pumps all through town, pumping sewer out to our water reclamation facility out in the northeast part of town here, outside of city limits. Maybe 2 years ago, we finished what's called the Southeast Interceptor sewer line, which really ran up around the southeast corner of Bend. I think it went up 27th to a little bit past the hospital. That was a gravity sewer line, much more robust, operates much more efficiently, and can handle much more capacity. The North Interceptor is another gravity sewer line that is going to open up sewer capacity in much of the northeast part of town. But from an economic development perspective, it also opens up Juniper Ridge. So they are finalizing what we call phase 1, which moves out from the water reclamation facility to essentially the edge of our urban growth boundary, maybe a little bit inside it. And then our infrastructure planning folks have begun construction on what we call phase 2, which keeps heading west, and jogs up into Juniper Ridge, opens up Juniper Ridge and the Brinson Business Park to significant amount of new sewer capacity. And these phases 1 and 2 are pretty exciting in that they open up this capacity. Juniper Ridge is really tight on sewer right now, and I'll talk a little bit more about Juniper Ridge at the end. Phase 3 is going to be much more focused on opening up housing capacity and maybe some mixed use commercial in what we call some of you may call it the Golden Triangle. We also you call it the North area as well. That third phase is not yet funded. It's something that we are working on right now, or I should say not yet fully funded. Of course, the design is underway, but it is very exciting to see that construction moved forward on the Juniper Ridge portion. Really just in the last couple of weeks, I think, is when we really broke ground and started moving forward there. I did want to touch on this too. Sewer is really hard to build in Central Oregon. Some places have rocky soil. We just have one big rock that we're all sitting on, right? So it takes a lot of blasting and certainly a lot of digging to get down to the grade you need to build a gravity sewer line, because you are reliant on the slope of that pipe versus running a bunch of pumps, which cost money and effort to maintain. So long-term, much more efficient, much more capacity, but in the short term, a heck of a lot of work to really build one of these things. So we're excited to see that going forward. All right, so I'm gonna shift gears again here. And if you're asking questions, I saw some come in. I'm happy to go back in the slides when we get to the Q&A if you need some clarification. So let's touch on development here. Permitting, what sort of volume are we seeing? What tools may be out there to help with development going forward? The first one here, permit volumes. I was saying to Hannah and Amy before, one of our big concerns in the first few weeks of this crisis was we're just going to see a precipitous drop in permits, right? Everyone's going to stop doing what they're doing, but that really hasn't been the case. You can see going back to March, fairly steady in terms of permit volume for building and safety applications, engineering applications the same, land use the same. There is a drop in June, that's partial month data, so I can share the link after this if anyone wants to keep track of that going forward. Overall, our permit volume compared to last year is slightly down, and that's a trend that's been going on since about 2018, maybe 2017, which I think you can attribute more to the fact that much of the developable land has kind of been eaten up in Bend over the last few years, or at least the years as we came roaring out of the recession. And now we're seeing more dense development, we're seeing infill development, we're not seeing a whole lot of industrial development because we simply don't have the industrial land available for some of that right now. So housing units actually stand to be significantly up in this biennium, but permit applications down because you're seeing big projects like the Shevlin mixed-use apartment complex on 14th and I want to say Simpson over there at the old Ray's site going forward. And I think that's, while that isn't totally Bend's future everywhere in town, there are certainly areas of town that are seeing that interest in kind of mixed use or apartment style development. So one of the big drivers for us seeing some of this denser development is because we're working through the implementation of our urban growth boundary plan, which was approved in December of 2016. For those of you that aren't familiar, we could spend a couple of hours talking about Oregon land use law, but at a high level, when you want to expand your city limits in Oregon, you go to the state and say, hey, can I do that? And they say, come back to us with a plan. And your plan has to typically incorporate some sort of densification in parts of town before they give you the green light to move out into these expansion areas that are outside your existing city limits. As our chief operating officer often says, Oregon is in the business of building cities, not sprawl. And that goes back to legal or policy decisions in the 70s with Governor Tom McCall that put this into effect. So I'll touch a little bit on this when we talk about urban renewal, but these are what we call opportunity areas, the shaded black areas, really mostly slated for densification. You can kind of ignore the ones here and here that are sort of different, but Bend's urban core, the state said if you want to go out, you got to go up. But where the work has really been going on over the last about a year is down in this southeast corner. So there's two ways you can annex in an expansion area into the city. You have to have a plan. You have to accommodate a certain amount of housing, a certain amount of employment land, commercial, industrial, and you have to figure out how to divvy that up and where you put the roads. If you go through that in a master plan process, typically you have 1 to 5 landowners that are sitting around a table and saying, all right, you know, Ben, you take this much commercial, you get this much residential, and you're going to foot the bill for a certain amount of transportation infrastructure and sewer infrastructure, and they cut a deal, right? And that's what we've seen on the west side over here. So they had a plan, a master plan approved by council. When you do it that way, one property owner or a limited amount of property owners, they can come up with that plan by themselves. This northeast corner, which is called Petrosa in city parlance right now, it was also another area master planned, approved by city council to move forward and begin expanding in. And in both of these cases, the developers themselves, the development itself, I should say, is paying for the infrastructure. City residents aren't expected to pay to essentially expand the urban growth boundary. It's supposed to be that new development that picks up the bill there. I expect we'll see a similar proposal at some point in the somewhat near future down here in what we call the DSL land, Department of State Lands, state-owned land that was recently, had a portion of it sold to a developer for I think $22 million. That person's gonna undoubtedly come forward with a plan to accommodate all those different uses and annex at least a portion of that item 12 into the city. Where it gets more complicated is where you have an area with numerous property owners, right? And what we call the southeast area was affectionately called the elbow during the UGB process. This area down here, 13, lots of different landowners, different opinions, not necessarily all coming with development expertise, although some of them that participated in this process definitely did. They're sitting around the table, and it's a city-initiated process. So the city is essentially operating as a mediator to figure out who gets what piece of land. And that Southeast area plan right now is, I think, about ready again to come to council at some point this year. They've been working for, I want to say, a solid year, maybe a little more at this point, to come to an agreement. They have what I'd call a very strong draft that I don't think has been presented to council yet, but they're going to see it soon. And once that's approved, you can annex it in. But again, you have to find a way for the development itself to build that infrastructure. That's another conversation to keep an eye on. Once item 13 down here, the elbow is done, the next one that probably is ripe for an area plan, although contingent again on some of that sewer capacity I touched on earlier, is this north area, the North Triangle, and Obi Riley as well. Again, a place where you have a lot of different property owners all wanting to kind of work together to figure out how to annex this into the city. So let's keep shifting gears here. Like I said, I'm bouncing around a lot. One way to, so densification itself is a very expensive thing to do. You have to build different sidewalks, different streetscapes, really a different infrastructure around a more walkable, dense type live work environment. And I mentioned that that's part of our charge for getting this UGB finished in the urban core. So what we have is what we call the core area project, urban renewal in the core. And the way urban renewal works, it's a tool that's been around for a long time, but in Oregon, you draw a boundary around a certain area. That area has an inherent amount of property tax revenue that it generates every year for all the different taxing districts, the county, the city, of course, school districts, the library, COCC, parks in Ben's case. And then every year that increment ticks up, right, by 3% or 2%, depending on assessed value. I'm sure many of you know much more about that than I do. So when you create an urban renewal area, you draw a boundary around a district like this one here, which is the core area, often called the Bend Central District or the BCD in the community as well. And then from there, you freeze that initial tax base. And I'll show you a slide that I think shows it a little better than this. But you freeze that tax base, and then any new increment is funneled back into that area for investment in increasing the growth in that area. And this is used for industrial areas as well. Juniper Ridge is an urban renewal area. But in the Central District, for example, if you had a lot that was paying $100 a year in property tax, and after 1 year, it was frozen, that 100 continues to go to all the existing taxing districts. Things tick up, and in year 2, it's paying $103. That $3 goes back to our Bend Urban Renewal Agency, which is essentially city council operating with a different charge, a different hat on, for investment solely in the core area. And what that does is you can take certain things off of a developer's plate to make a project move forward. You can help with business assistance. You can build affordable housing. I'll show you some of the projects that are being proposed, or at least the general line items. This is going to council in August of 2020. My coworker, Matt Stewart, and Justin as well have been going around and talking to taxing districts, because you really need buy-in from taxing districts to move forward with this, because they are giving up short-term revenue, right, to make it happen. And the end result, and we're not trying to build the Pearl District in the center of Bend, but the probably strongest example of urban renewal in Oregon is the Pearl District, where they created an urban renewal area in 1998, I believe, and had some initial large-scale development in that area. And that new property tax revenue stayed in the area, and it sort of built on itself to where you redevelop that whole area with both private investment, but then public investment coming in behind it. to help that move forward. So here's how that investment may break down over the 30 years of a potential urban renewal area in Bend's core. You can see anticipating about 194 million in that TIF, that tax increment funding, that increment above the initial assessed value that would stay the same going to all the taxing districts. So plenty of transportation projects being built. Of course, that area has historically been an industrial area, now really shifting to a mixed use zone. So that requires investment in sidewalks and different streetscapes and on-street parking and beautification and utilities and all that sort of good stuff. That's where the lion's share is going. Affordable housing and redevelopment assistance. We had a downtown urban renewal area which retired in 2012. So at some point you declare victory in urban renewal and all of that increment flows back out. But there's an affordable housing development attached to the parking garage in downtown Bend that was assisted with urban renewal funds. So we've seen some success with this before. Urban renewal in that case also built the downtown parking garage. Business and redevelopment assistance, again, this can be taking things off the table for a developer to make it work, whether it's infrastructure or the like. But it can also be something as simple as facade improvements. So in many cases, or in many urban renewal areas across the state, you've had an area where the bones of the buildings are nice, right? But they've just been in disrepair for a fair amount of time. So you can provide grants for the building owner to just improve the look without actually having to go through a whole scraping and replacing of that property. Of course, open space, when you're talking about an urban style or renewal area versus a Juniper Ridge open space and wayfinding and the like are important. And then of course there's administration and implementation costs. Again, this is all spread out over 30 years, not talking about $10 million upfront for administration or anything like that. This is really all contingent on what I'll show you here, which is an increase in the assessed value over time. So as I mentioned, you start with an assessed value over here on the left. As you move through, you start to generate a little bit of increment. You reinvest that in, and you get more and more and more. And of course, at the end, you pay off any, before the end of the term. Here you can see, a little bit after 2050. And then you've got a whole new assessed value for the area that is significantly higher than it would have been if you hadn't pursued the urban renewal. That's the goal. It isn't always successful, but I certainly think the board and the counselors that worked on this one are confident in its success. It's a fairly conservative plan. Justin can maybe chat about that at the end. But again, the goal is if you're a resident of Bend, this helps create more opportunity for housing and employment and those sort of things that are required under our land use and urban growth boundary goals. But if you're a taxing district that would say, hey, why am I going to give up any potential revenue over a period of time? It's because the goal at the end is you have an area with a much higher tax base and hopefully a more resilient economy as well, sitting there at the end of 30 years. And again, like I mentioned, at some point the urban renewal area expires and that assessed value then flows back out to all the other taxing districts. Wow, that's a lot to cover. Urban renewal, we could have spent an hour and a half just chatting about that. So I did want to wrap up with just where do we go from here? So I haven't touched much on the COVID-19 response, but of course that's an enormous focus right now. That's really been where most of my work has been for the last 3 months. So it took some real review of some of this stuff to kind of jog my memory, the items I've covered. The city of Bend, of course, we're dealing with financial concerns right now, just like any government agency, and really don't have a whole lot of free revenue anyway in terms of discretionary revenue at the city. It mostly goes to emergency services and streets. So we didn't have a lever we could pull to help get money out to the community when this first struck. One thing we could do, and we had the approval of council and our city manager's emergency declaration providing justification as well, was removing rules in the short term or relaxing rules to help businesses kind of either stay open or get back open when the closure order is lifted. So a big one that we've been working on over the past I'd say, month was extending outdoor options for businesses, everything from being a little more broad in where we allowed sidewalk cafes downtown, as long as they don't affect ADA or accessibility, allowing for the use of private parking lots for things other than parking. And I think Crux is a good example of that. If you've been up there, they're using about 30% of their parking for additional seating and to kind of control how many folks can get into their outdoor area for dining and drinks and all that sort of good stuff. And then finally, the big one that we've been working with council and businesses on is actually using part of the city right-of-way, so streets, parking spots, to allow businesses to expand out and have more outdoor space when their indoor space is limited under phase 1 and phase 2 guidelines. We've seen some limited success on that so far, but a lot of interest. So Tin Pan Alley, where the Tin Pan Theater and San Simon restaurant is, they are blocking that off every evening to extend out through that whole alley, and we're trying to kind of facilitate that and take some of the cost off the business's plate as well. The key thing we're waiting on is funds. So about $1.6 billion were allocated to the state of Oregon by the CARES Act. Up to $600 million of that could be allocated to cities and counties to get out to businesses and the community at that level. We haven't seen a whole lot of that yet. We're hopeful we're going to see some in the short term. We are bringing an amended council goal for council consideration on July 15th, I believe, that really focuses on two things with some of those funds. One is direct business assistance. So can we help childcares and Bend get back off the ground as folks are returning to work? I know if any of you have kids at home and you're trying to work, that's a common concern I've heard from business owners and employees. Also in that direct business assistance, just help purchasing PPE, any startup costs, maybe some help revamping your business model, moving to touchless payments or more of a web-based presence. These are all things we've allocated fund, or we've worked with the Bend Chamber, who's been very successful at allocating funds, which we haven't provided yet, but look at them, are looking to them as kind of a model for funneling some of this money through to help businesses in the short term. The second item under there, if we get some allocation, is new industry recruitment and development. Juniper Ridge continues to see interest from developers, but there are costs there. Could we put some of the money up there? I should say interest from businesses, not developers, businesses that want to locate up there, but there are significant costs to get located. Could we set some of that money aside to really help continue to diversify our economy, to really build that career ladder that we've historically lacked in Bend, but I think from the Great Recession to now, we've seen it expand, but how do we make sure we don't lose that momentum coming out of the Great Recession? Of course, there are other funding sources that may be coming soon. There's conversations about a next federal stimulus, and the state continues to release RFPs for requests for funding that we would then get out. We are applying for those whenever they show up. And then my question for you, understanding that really one of the things we can do right now is try to relax code, especially if it's a short-term thing that might help a business stay afloat. I would encourage you to reach out if you're seeing anyone run into problems with city code. If it's something more permanent, system development charges being too high, that's a pretty hard one to work through. But if it's something like sign code, let me know and we can work through it. So I did want to touch just at the end on, there's plenty more questions out there. And if I knew the answers to some of these, I probably wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be on a yacht somewhere, right? But development interest in the Opportunity Zone, which is a federal program that really lays over much of that urban core where we're going to have an urban renewal area. We're still getting interest there. And I think folks are now looking more to Bend as concerns kind of continue to grow around really dense large cities, right? We're hearing from folks in New York and wherever that mid-sized cities may be the kind of target for a lot of families in the future after this crisis. Again, it's a very similar thing at Juniper Ridge. We are seeing development interest out there, business interest, which is exciting. The enterprise zone is our lone real business incentive. It allows us to abate property taxes for a certain amount of time for traded sector businesses that are expanding. That expires in 2021. Will we be able to get it back? That remains to be seen. I know I'm running out of time here and I want to leave time for questions. So we've made some code changes that I think will help speed development in certain parts of town that we're kind of looking forward to seeing how those pan out, and we're monitoring those. And then will housing development continue, right? That's a big one. And along with housing development, what kind of houses or housing will the market be looking for coming out of COVID when this crisis ends? And of course it will end at some point. And the big question is, will Bend benefit from a shift to remote work? And it may not be remote work working from your home, but as I've discussed with my friends at EDCO and others, it could be the potential for a business that is sitting on one large campus somewhere to start to move divisions to other areas of the country, understanding that they're not going to hit those speed bumps that they thought they made before. So that's one we're watching, and I think ties back into that discussion around new industry recruitment and economic diversification. So that was a lot of ground to cover. Took me a little longer than I thought. Sorry, Amy and Hannah, but I would love to answer any questions folks may have.
Awesome, thank you, Ben. That was a great presentation, a lot of really good information. We do have a couple of questions in the queue right now, so I'll just get started with that. The first question is, what is the Petrosa development? Is that the Butler Market, Deschutes Market? And do you know what's going into that corner?
Yeah, it is. Let me back up here so you can see it. So the Petrosa development is largely residential, and Justin may actually know the number, but I think something like 900 housing units. And then there's some commercial, it is up here. It was Polish Homes and some other folks came forward with a development proposal. And some homes, some commercial, those are the two big things up there. But of course, housing is a big need. And part of that development agreement that council approved was the construction of some roundabouts and some transportation infrastructure up there as well.
Perfect. The next question is, this may not be related, but wondering why the flower baskets are missing from downtown this year.
I can answer that, yes. So I'm an ex officio on the Downtown Bend Business Association board, so help advise them on issues they're dealing with. So the Downtown Bend Business Association is relying on really two piece revenue streams to operate. So one, they get from essentially a self-imposed tax on business owners downtown that are building owners that they vote on. The other part is fundraising. They essentially pay for their Oktoberfest, or excuse me, their flower baskets with their Oktoberfest festival. And that isn't going to go forward this year. Like many events, it's been canceled. So they are working with some of their board members and business stakeholders to find a way to get something up. But yes, with their revenue shortfall, that was one of the ones that after surveying some of their members, they're trying to find a way around it. But they weren't able to cut the check and pay the roughly $20,000 in maintenance for the summer to water those plants. So,
okay,
good question. I wasn't expecting that one, but.
Brian Wilkinson chimed in on the chat and said that Petrosa has 1,100 residential units and 20 acres of commercial.
Thank you, Brian. More than I thought, but that's great.
Yeah. And I had a question as well. You spoke to extended outdoor seating potentially happening for the restaurants downtown. Is that what's happening with the tents that are outside 900 Wall?
It is, yes. So 900 Wall, Good Drop Wine Shop, Boss Taurus, I think it's those three on that kind of western end of Minnesota between Bond and Wall. They all came forward with a proposal asking to use some of the parking spaces. The city was able to provide some of the basic safety infrastructure, right? So these, I mean, they're not the prettiest things, but they're water-filled sort of bollards at the end. So you have some safety, and then the business owners are setting up increased outdoor dining out there. And we've seen some other interest too. Deschutes Brewery, the pub, wants to use some parking spaces up on out front of their pub on Bond as well for a similar thing.
What is the application process like for that?
It's as simple as I think we could possibly make it, but it's still not quite as simple as I would have liked, if I'm being frank. So you have to submit at least a drawing of what you're hoping to do. Typically would require engineered plans and things like that, but we have traffic engineers that are helping folks through the process. If anyone has questions or wants to check it out, bendoregon.gov/reopening has the actual application materials on there. But providing a basic plan, and then there's really some liability and insurance requirements that businesses have to go through. And the real big hurdle there is you need to carry a $2 million umbrella insurance policy if you're going to extend out into the right of way. And that's not a city requirement, that's a state kind of tort requirement. So there's a liability threshold that the insurance needs to meet, which I think it's been a tough one for some smaller businesses, but for larger ones or restaurants, for example, the investment is worth the potential gain in customers.
Okay, next question is, what is being developed on the west of the Surf Rapids?
I can't remember the name, but it's a 3 or 4 story, I want to say 3-story apartment complex. So there were actually, I think it went through a variance process and was appealed to the state, and they worked, the developer and some of the folks that were concerned about it worked together to reduce it to, I want to say it's 3 stories, but it's a fairly significant number of units, maybe 100, 120, something like that. And I'm not sure where they are in the process, if they're just doing site prep or if they're actually really gung-ho and moving forward. But that's an area that, yeah, it's all housing.
Okay. And our last question on here is, are these maps available on a website and accessible to anyone?
Yes, yeah, I'm pretty sure. I think I pulled most of them just from their specific project web pages. So you can typically find them on there. Amy has my my PowerPoint presentation, which she'll send out afterwards. So if anyone wants to check out any of those maps, you can find them there. And my contact information is on there. If you're looking for a better version than screenshotting off of a PDF that of this presentation, let me know and we can get you connected with it.
Okay. And
sorry, Hannah, I saw someone raise their hand, but I can't see exactly who it was. So feel free to answer or enter any question in the Q&A tab there. Go ahead, Hannah.
The apartment complex that you just spoke about, she wants to know where that's located.
So I think that's Shevlin, Hickson. If you're at the Whitewater Park, there's the Colorado Bridge overpass and there's that pedestrian underpass, right? Over there on the west side of the Whitewater Park. It's up a berm from there. So I think I can't remember the cross street, but if you were,
near
I don't
the
think I have a good enough map, but.
Is it near the pavilion?
It is. It's sort of sandwiched between the pavilion and the Whitewater Park.
Okay.
That's a good way to.
Okay. I hope
on
that
Colorado there.
Okay. Well, looks like that's all the questions that we have in the queue. Oh, we have one more. Are you aware of any incentives to develop more low-income housing in Bend, and what areas would be best for that?
That's a great question. We have an affordable housing program that is leveraged, I want to say $12 million in affordable housing fees since 2006 into something like $80 or $90 million worth of affordable housing development. And affordable housing in this case, we call it capital A, capital H affordable housing. So it's housing specifically directed to folks making 80% or less of area median income. There is a project underway, or at least it will be underway soon, along that Empire corridor, where I talked about cutting through the Pine Nursery Park up there. I can't remember what it's called off the top of my head, but a significant one. I would say if anyone has interest in developing affordable housing, or low-income housing, if you want to call it that, I would be eager and very willing to get you in touch with our affordable housing manager. I'd say everywhere in town is in need of affordable housing, right? And we will work to get you connected with potential incentives along with potential funding as well. Not always enough to make it work, but it's always worth a conversation.
Great. Do you know what is planned for the vacant land across the street from Spoken Moto?
Is that, I should have mentioned that. So I think that area down here is what we call the Corpine site. It's the same area. If you're up on the lawn at Crux, you're kind of looking down into it. That may not be the right spot. Yeah, that is. Okay, so it's called the Corpine site of the former Corpine. I think it was a plywood manufacturing mill, but that area is owned by one landowner, and it's slated as mixed-use development. Again, that kind of live, work, walkable development. My sense, I think there's interest in developing there. My sense is they're waiting to see what happens with urban renewal, because there are some real big hurdles to get the development moving there, and that it's probably a tool that they would want to tap into. I should have touched on that one because it's certainly an interesting one. I'll say I drove through there with some folks from out of the Portland area that worked in urban renewal up there. We showed them Juniper Ridge. They thought, oh, that's kind of neat. And they saw the Core Pine site, and they were, you know, they're stuck against the window going, this could be amazing, right? So I think that's something that'll move forward, but it's going to be a little bit of time.
Okay, great, thank you. Is there a plan to enhance the current bus system, especially with regard to proximity of affordable housing?
The city of Bend itself doesn't operate the bus system. It's operated by COIC, the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. We help fund it to the tune of, I think, $2 or $3 million a year. I think there is an interest, and there are efforts underway to enhance the bus system. And certainly when we cite affordable housing, but again, I'm talking capital A, capital H, I'm not talking about general affordable housing that doesn't have restrictions around it. Proximity to bus systems is something that comes into play, or transit systems, I should say, as folks cite. But I think Justin unmuted there, and Justin's a real affordable housing expert, so.
Yeah, as Ben mentioned, the current Cascade East Transit is actually operated by COIC. We subsidize it from the City of Bend's general fund to about on average $1.5 million a year. They've actually received a fair amount of funds from the CARES Act. There's also the transportation bill that was passed by the Oregon legislature in 2017 implemented a payroll tax that we all pay, and those so between those, they actually are receiving significant funds. Part of our transportation system plan update that Ben had touched on a little bit is we're actually trying to, and CET is actually going through a master plan process right now and kind of re-envisioning what the bus system or the transit system could look like. And right now they're focused on a hub and spoke model, which can be somewhat inefficient. And so really what they're trying to go to is to do transportation hubs. And so that way, instead of everybody running out of Hawthorne Station, which honestly Hawthorne Station is far over capacity from what it was originally designed for, which actually has created issues with the neighbors and some of the commercial development around Hawthorne. It's become, there's just way more people coming in and out of and through Hawthorne Station than should be. And so what they're trying to do is disperse that and so you would have, I think the plan right now is to have 5 transportation hubs. And so one of the problems or one of the challenges in transit is that last mile, is how you get people from their location to transit and back. And so that transportation hub actually can change that. So you'll have a bus system or a bus that comes in and out and connects in between all these different, these 5 hubs throughout the city, but it gets people closer to where they're actually, where their destinations are. And then the other piece, so the other part that you would have is that you'd have lots of different options. So you can do then ride share from that hub to your destination, or scooters or bikes, or bring your own car. So it's a different model. The other piece that was planned as part of the bond is that we would actually be funding rapid transit lines on 3rd Street, basically. And then also Greenwood, I think, was the east-west line. And so that way it would give priority in signalization. It wouldn't be an additional lane or anything like that, but it would build some infrastructure in technology as far as giving priority to the buses so they can kind of just pass right through the lights. And then also do cutouts, because right now what you see is when the buses stop on 3rd Street is that they block traffic and then create traffic backups. And so they would actually have cutouts so they could pull over and get out of the travel lanes and not be blocking other traffic. So there was some of those other pieces. So I think you will see a different transit system than what we currently have coming in the future.
Looks like we have a couple of questions speaking to that as well. Will the City of Bend expand Glen Vista to accommodate pedestrian and bicycle lanes? And will transit be considering electric buses in the future?
Yeah, I'll touch on the electric. I actually, as my role as a city councilor, I also serve on the Bend Metropolitan Transportation Planning Organization, the Bend MPO. And so I'm the chair of that. And last year, I actually signed a letter in support of a grant that CET submitted to the federal government. I don't know where for electric buses, so I'm not sure exactly where they're at in that grant process, but I know that they were trying to receive some grant funds. I think there are some challenges with the electric buses. I know in some cities that have a fair amount of topography, that there has been some challenges in that, and there's some concerns on how they work in some of our colder climate, but I know the CET is definitely looking at that. As far as Glen Vista, I am familiar a little bit with that. The challenge with Glen Vista, which is the road goes from Obie Riley to the Riley Ranch Preserve, is that some of that road is within the city limits, some of it's within the county, and so I think we probably that's probably a good role for the Bend MPO, because our MPO boundaries are bigger than the city limits, not by much, but some. And so we kind of act as a coordination group. And I think the city and the county probably need to coordinate a little bit with what Glen Vista looks like as far as a design standard, because you'll have the pieces that are within the city, as those lands get developed around Glen Vista, will be developed to urban type standards. But then if you go west a little bit, that's more of a county type standard. And so I think there should be, and could be a little more coordination between the city and the county and what that road looks like.
There's another one kind of speaking to that. Will the Riley Ranch Nature Preserve that is part of Bend Parks and Rec be moved into the city to comply with green space requirements? But it sounds like that's probably still in flux.
Yeah, I would say on that, I would be surprised, because currently it's not within Bend's urban growth boundary. And so that would have to be part of a consideration in the next urban growth boundary, which from our UGB expansion that we did in 2016, there actually is a requirement. So we're legally bound as a city to start our next urban growth boundary expansion or urban area reserve by basically December of 2021. So that'll be part of that process. I couldn't speak to that at this point.
And would that UGB expansion be implemented at that time, or would it just drafted?
That's when, the way I understand the requirement is that we have to start the process within 5 years of adoption of the previous one, which was December of 16. So by December of 21, we have to have started our next urban growth boundary process. Hopefully it won't take as long and cost as much money.
Okay, we do have one more question. I thought I heard a rumor that City Hall might be considering a move to the Bend Central District. Is that true, or are there any plans for relocating City Hall services?
Do you want me to take it, Justin? Or?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. The council did direct the city manager to start evaluating other opportunities for City Hall. Kind of before, of course, this was all before COVID, so COVID potentially has changed some of that and changed some of our needs. And I think what we've learned is that we can, I think like all businesses, is that the city can operate to some degree remotely. Some employees can operate remotely. The downtown campus has been, bursting at the seams. We own a fair amount of land in a fairly expensive part of the city. And I personally think that it would be a good thing to move City Hall out of downtown. Because when you look at the physical center of the city, is right underneath the Franklin undercrossing. And when City Hall should be easily accessible to all people throughout the entire city. The city will continue to grow to the east in the future. And so I think planning and building a city hall somewhere in the central district is not, it would be a good thing to be easily accessible to all people in the city, but also could act as a catalyst type project as far as that urban renewal area goes. One thing I will note is that we have no intention of using any of that urban renewal dollars to build a city hall. We will figure that out separately from that, because that definitely changes how that plan would be put together. And then, one thing on that urban renewal plan is that we don't need, positive votes from the other jurisdictions. At this point, they're in the process of making comments to us, and they have until I think July 23rd to make comments, and then the council can either approve, just reject, or make modifications as requested by the different taxing districts. If we were to actually put in public, use those funds for a public building, it would require votes of all the taxing districts, and we are not doing that at this time or ever. That's not the plan.
Glad you clarified that. Thanks, Justin.
Looks like another one came in. Could the city use condemnation in the central district to move and expand City Hall?
Theoretically, I think we could. I would not be in favor of that. I think we have to be very careful how we do condemnation. I'm a big proponent of private property rights, and I think the city would have to go in and try to negotiate, property for that. One of the challenges in the central district that the average lot size is 17,000 square feet. So it takes an assembly of lands. You never say never, but that would not be my first. That's not how I would want to go into that. I think the city should acquire land at, on the open market, just like anybody else.
I'd say, just in my experience too, watching council consider condemnation as an option when infrastructure projects begin, it's always a discussion. And of course, you move into actual negotiation with property owners. Something they take pretty seriously is not wanting to do that unless it's really the last option there. I'd say across the board, that's been the case.
Okay, it looks like that's all for questions. Ben and Justin, thank you both for your time and for all the work in putting this together and being available to answer questions for all of the attendees. I think everything talked about today here was really valuable, so thank you both.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great.
A reminder that this is recorded, so all of our attendees will have access to this video. We're going to post it on our Central Oregon Western Title Facebook page. And if you want access to any of the slides or maps, feel free to reach out to Amy or myself and we can connect you with those.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.